There's quite a lot in that last piece that is very interesting. I'd like to come back on one aspect of what you said, which is the leadership.
Yeah.
Leadership in the importance, the significance of leadership in the changes that we've seen over the last 10 years and so. Do you think the client, because clients that have been rather ambivalent towards their role of leadership within the construction process. Some actively taking a leadership role and actually working very closely with the industry to kind of develop the kind of products and services that they desire, that they require. Other clients have been a bit more reluctant to become involved in the minutiae of improving the industry's performance. What's your view on that? Do the majority of clients wish to be involved in changing the industry, or has it been rather reluctant to do it and see it more as the industry's responsibility to put its own house in order? Because coming back to Egan for a moment, Egan played great emphasis on the role of the client in leading changes within the construction industry.
I think there are probably clients who are in a position to have an influence, and then there are clients who are not. And I think there are probably two areas of leverage. One of which is if you have sufficient workload that you can actually create a changed agenda. And there I think the public sector, almost by default, has changed the landscape. And if one thinks of the importance that public sector framework-based opportunities have in the current marketplace, and how many contractors have come to see those as being very significant opportunities in terms of sustained workload, good levels of turnover and margin, then that has come from a client body that's consciously changed the way in which it's worked. Now, why it's done that is an interesting question, because nothing happens in isolation, and one of the parallel trends to the growth of the use of frameworks, for example, has been growing complexity of European procurement. So one of the reasons why, for example, local authorities have let more repair and maintenance work to large frameworks is because it's simpler to do it that way. And around that, then, of course, you can create a whole set of metrics in terms of performance measurement and such like. How successful those metrics have been in terms of driving improvement, I don't really have access to an awful lot of evidence on that, although we did do some work in the education sector which suggested that for a long-term framework in the south of England, that in terms of the certainty of delivery projects, performance in these frameworks was very good indeed. So I think those clients there have genuinely been able to change the landscape, and there are positives and there are negatives there. So there are some mid-scale contractors who've done fantastically well out of this. There are an awful lot of SMEs who've suddenly found themselves out in the cold. Yes. And you can also see that in terms of the way in which what might have been previously described as public sector workload, healthcare, education, which would have gone to a sort of a diverse group of designers and contractors, that's increasingly got locked into frameworks which are dominated by the big designers, the large contractors. So it's important to see that in some ways, there are pros and there's cons here, because in some ways we're getting a much more homogenous marketplace, much more difficult for new entrants to come in. Now, I think the other example, so that's the example of clients having leverage, clout, to be able to drive genuine change. I think the other area you might describe is where clients have the opportunity through project profile to show things can be done differently. And there I think you can actually go well before the sort of whole appearance of the Egan agenda to to people who were doing things differently in the 1980s, probably going beyond that. And then you can see individual projects now which suggest a way of things that are going forward. So if one was to take a long-standing client of ours, John Lewis Partnership, they've exemplified working in a collaborative way over probably decades. So they work with the same people, established long relationships, but at the same time they've evolved and responded to their marketplace, because retail is a fairly tough place, and you can't be collaborative all of the time. But they exemplify a set of values that go right through the business, and that goes through the way in which they treat their construction projects as well. They don't, for example, withhold retention. They don't look for performance bonds. So there's a different way of working there. Other organisations, in terms of one thinks of one of our development clients, Stanhope, who have a history that goes back to Broadgate back in the late 80s, which was there as a client was saying, well, actually we can do office development in a completely different way. We can do it faster, we can do it at a higher value relative to cost, we can deliver better quality product. And we're going to do that by working directly with the supply chain, giving them a degree of certainty in terms of their workload and pushing them really hard. So in that case, that shows what a really demanding client can get out of an industry who really responds to demanding clients. And if there's one thing I'd say that over the last 4 or 5 years is we've probably seen more of those demanding clients, because in many ways the environment which they work in has become more demanding. Yes. Planners have seen that capital values have increased, so they can get more from residential developers. They can secure more value in terms of investment of public realm from commercial retail and office development. There are more stakeholders, projects are more complicated. So everybody's having to work an awful lot harder. And if you weren't working in a fairly collective and joined up way, you probably things would fall through the gaps. But I wouldn't want the audience to get the impression that everything's absolutely sorted out, that we're in a sort of Garden of Eden of everybody sorting things out with a handshake. It's still a tough market out there. Things are done for a commercial reason, or to spend taxpayers' money in as cost-effective way as possible. So it's the art of the possible rather than in terms of what you might describe as an optimal solution.